Now, from somewhere in beautiful downtown Burbank, NBC once more tries to prevent...
What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
This flat tire needs a man, but when there's no man around, when there's no man around, Goodyear should be. Why? Watch this. New Goodyear Double Eagle carries its own spare inside. Lifeguard safety spare. A tire in a tire. Keeps on going. Next time, give her a second chance.
In the criminal justice system, sexually based offenses are considered especially heinous. In New York City, the dedicated detectives who investigate these vicious felonies are members of an elite squad known as the Special Victims Unit. These are their stories.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It's about that time again, David. A new episode of Notes from an Artist. I'm your co-host, Tom Semioli, and my co-host of a co-host of a co-host is David C. Gross, or so I am told. David, please greet our listener.
Hey, Karen, how are you today? This is a really good episode. I think you're going to like it. Very, very educational, as well as very, very musical.
How odd. Okay, David, our guest this evening is Bob Gluck. He is an author and a musician, and his new book is entitled Pat Metheny, Stories Beyond Words, out now on University of Chicago Press. Now, I grew down in the mid-'70s, and the jazz fusion guitar heroes of that era were John McLaughlin, Al Di Meola, and Larry Coryell. They were kind of like shred guys.
Excellent!
I don't think the shred word existed back then. But Pat Metheny had more of an ambient aesthetic, and he was a song player rather than a soloist, a real lyrical player. Of course, the first album we all heard from him was Bright Sized Life in 1975 with Jaco Pastorius, this new kid on the block from South Florida. Then, of course, the Pat Metheny Group started in 1977. And it is hard to believe that Pat Metheny has been a recording artist for 50 years now, because every time you hear him, he sounds so young, so new, and so fresh. But this is going to be an extraordinary journey through Pat Metheny's career, because, David, we're going to do this in more than one episode.
At least two, probably three, believe it or not. Going back to the Jocko and Pat Metheny record, Bright Side Life, I remember listening to it, enjoying it, but not being overwhelmed. It seemed to me like whatever take the bass was going to have, the electric bass for that matter, it seemed progressive in an almost structured way. So for me, I just wanted to learn how to play some of those licks. But it didn't strike me as something so totally revolutionary. Of course, with Weather Report and his solo album, yes, those were more revolutionary. But this seemed to me like this is where the electric bass was headed. You know, you think about Jack Bruce, James Jamerson, and all of the players from the late 60s into the 70s, and yeah, this is how it should have progressed, which is what it actually did.
Well, it's interesting. Jocko took on the aesthetic of his bandleader in that he played the song as opposed to the bass. And yes, if you listen to Jocko on that Pat Metheny album, which is really the album that introduced him to the world, although I think him and Pat did a record before that that was, I think, released later on once Jocko received. Yeah, Jocko played the songs, and there's nothing revolutionary about his playing. It's his tone. And I think what happened to us back then in 75 was we were just so enraptured with the whole approach that Pat Metheny took that I don't think any one instrument stood out, really. And again, it's because Pat Metheny was, and always will be a song player.
I would agree with that. I also think a lot of the young bassists, let's say, those that had sort of forsaken just three-chord rock and roll, not to denigrate that, I love playing three-chord rock and roll. I love playing one note on three-chord rock and roll. I've termed num-nums.
Num, 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 num.
Num, 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 num. However, once you got that technique down, it was almost like, where do you go? Obviously, there was Genesis, yes, and some of the more progressive bands like Soft Machine and stuff, they were taking it from rock and roll into something a little different. And if you were adept on your instrument, you were headed that direction. And that's why I think from a progression forward, Jocko and Pat Metheny record wasn't that unexpected. How about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think Pat Metheny was also one of the artists that jazz guitarists, who had a great disdain for rock guitarists, could actually accept.
Yeah, that too. But then there was another person that people don't really mention, but it's Alan Holdsworth. And I remember Alan Holdsworth from a band called Tempest. And I see this progression of the bass. And I think bass players of my age going forward would agree that it was a natural progression because we were all getting better. There was Cream, there was Entwistle with The Who, there was a lot of technique going on with the bass. I think the quote-unquote revolution of Jocko came from other instrumentalists and not bass players.
Right, exactly. And don't forget, recording technology was vastly improving in the 70s, so now we could really hear the bass.
That's right.
We're on the dawn of digital technology, but we're going to do this show in more than one part. David, tell us what fascinated you about the beginning of the show.
I was playing a lot of rock music, but I was listening to a lot of the avant-garde. And when you grow up in Manhattan, it's easy to go to an early show at the Fillmore and then walk down 3rd Street and go to Slugs and see some of the finest avant-garde. There are even moments when I was able to see John McLaughlin at the Cafe A-Go-Go, if you can imagine that. That's another death trap in the basement that, God forbid, there was a fire, right?
Exactly.
But while this avant-garde thing was going on, there was loft jazz, there was fusion. You also had the young classical players and composers doing things that were not your standard fare, which actually fell in better with the avant-garde jazz movement than with quote-unquote classical music. So I was listening to a lot of that, and apparently Bob Gluck was listening to a lot of that thanks to his rabbi. So when we end up getting to the playlist for tonight's show, it's really wild. It's an avant-garde set list.
I haven't got a clue, but if it's avant-garde, you know all about it. Okay, before we bring Bob into the room, into the metaphorical room, David, we have to do the plug.
Why, I've never been so insulted in my life.
Well,
it's early yet.
He's had a change of heart.
A lot of good that'll do him. He's still got the same face.
I welcome you with open arms.
Is that so? How late do you stay open?
You, our listener Karen, can hear Notes from an Artist live on the radio, on the internet radio, every Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Cygnus Radio. That is www.cygnusradio.com, and you queue that up on the browser of your choice. David, did you know that you can hear the Notes from an Artist podcast on Apple, Amazon, Buzzsprout, and Spotify, and wherever podcasts are podified? I've said this to you 1,000 times.
Unbelievable.
Unreal. Now, David, you may ask yourself who's listening. Well, and who's talking about us. We are in the top 10% of all 3.2 million podcasts registered on the planet Earth and thereabouts. But David, how many countries and how many territories and how many cities are we in?
Oh man, there were too many. We're in a total of 2,063 cities. I did not know there were 2,063 cities.
I don't think there was circumstance.
I was under the impression it was 2,062, so I was off by one.
And how many territories and fjords?
Well, we're in about 122 countries, and there again, I thought there were only 121 countries.
I'm afraid, Dave.
I learned something new.
Look at that. David learns from this show. David, did you know that Notes from an Artist has a YouTube page? And if you want to see some of our past guests, some of our select past guests, go to Notes from an Artist on YouTube. And of course, if you want to know what David and I are up to any given moment, go to www.notesfromanartist.com.
Very interesting, but not too nostalgic.
However, you can safely say that whatever we're up to, it's no good. We
It's
are
no
up
good.
to no good.
Right, exactly. We make a lot of stuff up. But anyway, it's an entertaining website, so do check out www.notesfromanartist.com. David, let us bring Mr. Bob Gluck into the room. We welcome Bob Gluck to the show. David, he is a musician, he is a composer, he is an educator, and he's an author. He's just like us, David.
That's true. However, he lives in Westchester, you live in New York, and I live in Connecticut.
Okay, I think Bob
It
probably
could
got
be the same person.
Good. Bob got the idea from us. Anyway.
Having been born and raised in Queens, and then gone to high school near where I'm living, and then lived all over the place, mostly Philadelphia, and then in Albany, a little in the Berkshires. I'm a New Yorker.
Okay, all right. We're here to discuss Bob's new book, Pat Metheny's Stories Beyond Words, out now on University of Chicago Press. That is available in hardcover. It's available in softcover. Probably available with no cover, Dave.
Take it off. Take it all off.
No,
Okay. You can get
but
it.
there is tipping musicians, exactly, even
That's
if it's
right.
no cover.
It's available digitally. It's on Kindle. It's on Google Books. I'm sure Bob will sell you a copy. I'm sure he's got a few stacked away in his basement.
Bob is not in that business, actually.
Good for you. Let's talk about some of your previous books, which are on my summer reading list. The Miles Davis Lost Quintet and Other Revolutionary Ensembles. That came out 2016 on University of Chicago Press. That is a fascinating topic. What led you to that?
First to say, that was sort of the necessary successor to my first book, which was You'll Know When You Get There, Herbie Hancock and the M1DC Band.
Right.
And there I was addressing 1969 to 1973 and thinking about Herbie Hancock's band of that time as in many ways being one of the streams that came out of Miles's 60s quintet and parallel to Miles's first electric bands. What I hadn't addressed in that book then was another slice of that, which was then Miles's own electric band, the way that I wanted to situate Miles's quote unquote lost quintet. So being a New Yorker, I was in college from 1973 to the later 70s. And I spent a lot of time back in the city, and I spent a lot of time going to various loft concerts, whether they were Studio Rivby, Sam Rivers, and others in that AACM Chicago transplants to New York world, or alternately Steve Reich and Phil Glass and that loft world, which were quite separate. and only came together at the kitchen at a certain point. So what really interested me about the Miles Band is that unlike the way that it's usually presented as kind of a Miles commercializing, Miles wanting to play rock and roll, which might have been true in some ways, but isn't that interesting to me. What struck me was the commonalities between Miles's quintet of the era with Chick Corea and Dave Holland and others, and then Holland and Corea's evolving project that kind of came out of that with Anthony Braxton and Barry Alishaw's Circle, who I never got to see, unfortunately. But I did see another band, the Revolutionary Ensemble with Leroy Jenkins,
amazing band,
and company, and saw a solo concert by Jerome Cooper. Got to know them a little bit back then. I mean, I was in my early 20s, so it was they were young, relatively, but incredibly respectful of young people and interested in chatting. And then I got to know each of them in the last couple of years or so before they died. Each of them died, and that was sort of a wonderful experience. Anyway, so the Miles book was very much about the kind of aesthetic similarities, the kind of glue that held each of those bands together, which was that they were essentially in different ways improvising collectives. They were engaging in different forms of collective improvisation by different rules, by different aesthetics. But the idea was really that the first thing you need to do as a musician is listen well. And these were all incredible listeners and responders. And for me, that not for everybody, but for me, that really came out of what I experienced listening to, not in person, but on recordings of Miles's 60s band, which from like 65, 66, particularly 67, was so completely about intuition and listening. And one of my regular things that I do, that I used to do in one of my classes was to take from 20 seconds to 2 minutes of a live recording from that Miles band, from that acoustic band before it went electric, and have people listen again and again and again. And what they'd be listening for is pairs and trios, like who starts something, who joins in, who pushes back against it, who is building something in the background that then comes to take over, that starts out as the wallpaper, and then all of a sudden it's the thing. So in particular, like Wayne Shorter's solos during that period, listening to Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams, how they just the depth of intuitive playing off of each other and feeding each other, and it's one of the wonders of the world for me, and all the rest of it comes out of that. And one could also argue that some similar aesthetics really come out of the Art Ensemble of Chicago and some of the Muhal, Richard Abrams, and others from that Chicago and the New York world.
Absolutely.
Well, David, I would say at this point, fuck your book. We got to talk about all the good stuff that happened before even Pat came about, because, well, Tom's a few years younger, and he has the audacity to think that the Weather Report band with Jocko was really the good band, when what you're basically saying, that's right, Tom, you can go away. You can go away.
No, I'm pointing to Bitches Brew, David. I hung that on the wall for you.
You're looking at Bitches Brew, but that was a later time.
Okay.
It's okay, Tom. It's all right to be young and impressionable.
I can handle things. I'm smart. Not like everybody says. Like dumb, I'm smart, and I want respect.
I'm just a 65-year-old cherub, Bob. I'm sorry.
I know, just a babe in the woods. But the thing where
you'll get over it though. Just wait a week, and it'll be something else.
Yes,
like a teenager.
Maybe a day. I don't know.
What's so interesting is that even though the Art Ensemble and Anthony Braxton were so important to improvisation, and some can say that Keith Jarrett made the best decision by sticking with his acoustic, because what ended up happening with Chick Corea is once he picked up the Moog, some of his soul was lost. As far as I'm concerned, I think everyone was trying to be the chops mavens that McLaughlin's band was, the Intermounting Flame and such. And it just never got there. It was too much noodling as far as I'm concerned.
Excellent!
The fact that the first Weather Report record was really a great combination of what happened pre-Electric Miles and then early Miles, that I think more than any other album was the bridge between both.
You just dropped so many different breadcrumbs there.
Thank you.
No, so that's a very rich question, really, and I appreciate it, and I can talk about it in terms of my own personal experience of all these bands. So I was a very precocious teenager. I had been going to Juilliard my entire growing up, and once we found ourselves in the suburbs, which just for the record, turns out I never understood what we were doing leaving the city. We were very happy, very connected to our communities. Turns out the New York City Board of Education was discriminating against women in teaching secondary school social studies. And my mother was never able to get her license, and she was off a job up at Briarcliff Manor. And so we moved, and I found that out 2 years before she died. So I would always go back into the city, ostensibly to go to Juilliard. It's sort of like a Miles story in a way. So Miles's parents would never imagine him like playing out, in clubs and so on. They wanted to be a respectable professional, be a doctor, maybe a lawyer, but they were okay with his going to Juilliard, but that's not really what he had his eyes on. It was 52nd Street. So I was going to Juilliard and then had my eyes all over the place, both musically and politically. And, we're talking here starting out in like 1968 when I was 13, turning 14. So in the years after that, I heard the first Weather Report album as soon as it came out. And I thought it was one of the most amazing things that I'd ever heard. And there actually is a book about Weather Report now that's actually quite good.
Kurt's book?
That's
Kurt Bianchi.
Yes.
Yeah, we had him on the
show. Yeah, we had him on the show.
So that spared me having to write that book. The book that I was really going to write, just as an aside, it's not really an aside, I was really interested in Wayne Shorter in 1970. And he recorded, I think, 2 or 3 Blue Note sessions. The Creation never came out. I never understood why it didn't come out. I have my theories. I have people who've whispered various things in my ears. I've heard it. Wayne Shorter was true to Wayne Shorter was, I was talking before about Herbie and Tony Williams. Well, Wayne Shorter could also have been viewed as sort of, the soul, the conscience, the spark plug of that Miles band. Anyway, though, so Wayne Shorter and then some of what became the Weather Report circle are doing these various recordings. Miroslav has his recording Purple. Joe Zawinul has Zawinul with the electric piano, with Echoplex duets with Herbie Hancock, Billy Hart, I think Eric Gravatt.
Woody Shaw.
What else is there to say? That's on definitely a Desert Islands album. In any event, so I think that the first time I saw Weather Report in concert was, I think, right before Sweet Nighter came out. And it was shocking at first to me because it was all about the groove, and there was very kind of funk-ish kinds of elements. And it took me about 5 minutes to go, this is not what I came here for, to like, this is an amazing groove. And I didn't know this part of Wayne Shorter, but it does echo back to Blakey's bands in a way. And even then, that it hadn't quite gotten to the next albums leading up to when Jocko joins. So the albums in Mysterious Traveler,
Tail Spinning, yeah.
Tail Spinning,
right?
And there was one other, all of which I really, really love. When I first heard Bitches Brew, I didn't really like it. I heard it at my rabbi's house, where I also heard, for the first time, Stockhausen. First time I heard the Beatles. I heard King Crimson there for the first time.
You had a very hip rabbi.
Oh my gosh. Incredibly inquisitive, curious, wonderful poet. I've had a lot of really, really important mentors for me. That's one that might seem unexpected, but if you knew him, his name was Chaim Stern. He's no longer alive. It would seem, well, of course, why wouldn't he be listening to Bitches Brew when it comes out? But I didn't quite get it. It wasn't King Crimson, and it wasn't Emerson, Lake and Palmer, who had kind of caught my eye at the moment. Tarkus was, and I was going to the Fillmore East a fair bit. My parents would not allow me to go to the Electric Circus, which I'm writing a book about. So I saw Mahavishnu there after the first album and right before the second. And that was a very, very chopsy band. And I think it was the loudest concert I've ever been to. So anybody who tells you the Rolling Stones are really loud, Grateful Dead at some points were very, very loud. Mahavishnu Orchestra was extremely loud. And some of Pat Metheny's bandmates, like Antonio Sanchez, and I've spoken about, so what is it like to be sitting at the drum kit surrounded by this phalanx of speakers at amazingly loud volumes, and I go, well, yeah, that's interesting. I bet that's loud. But let me tell you about sitting near the front in front of one of the speaker stacks, seeing Mahavishnu back in 1971. So then I saw Return to Forever. I think Al Di Meola had just joined, or maybe he'd been in for a few months. So they were just really landing on their feet. And they were a pretty chopsy band. See, David, I certainly agree about that. And I'd already learned about Circle, and Circle blew my mind far more than Return to Forever did. But I loved those first couple of albums.
Well, are you meaning the first couple of albums like Light as a Feather?
Oh, really good question. So I didn't mean that. So those are like the early
ECM.
I mean, one of them was ECM,
another
one was Polygram, one was ECM. I heard those slightly later. I had my friends who at college were really into the Gary Burton albums, particularly
Genuine
Steve Swallow.
Funeral.
Well, we're talking really like 73, 74 in that early
period. So you see the age difference between you and I as well.
David's always picking on. David likes to pick on the youngsters.
So yeah, there you go. So I will tell you though that at where I started at college, which was just an amazing place, which was the Crane School of Music at SUNY Potsdam, and we had a professor named Don Funes, who's been dead 25 years now, whose perspective was that his students should learn, not an original phrase to me, it's really Henry Cowell's, like he wanted to live in a world of music. So our analysis classes were as much about Ravi Shankar, Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick, as it was Webern Cantata, as it was Beethoven sonatas. I mean, it was all grist for the mill, and that had a big impact with me. But what I heard then was not, and Pat Metheny the first time I encountered Pat Metheny, just not personally, but seeing him play, was a skinny, 19-year-old playing with Gary Burton. Because Gary would do a lot of clinics at colleges, and the percussion teacher, James Peterzak, where I was going to school, would have folks come in, and Gary was one of those. So that was just also an experience. The other experience at the time, and I'm not losing the chops versus, kind of open creative spirit that I think, exploratory kind of spirit that I think, David, that I think you mean.
Yes.
One of my classmates, Mitchell Foreman, who went on to play with all sorts of folks, including Wayne Shorter and McLaughlin's Mahavishnu of the 1980s. And I remember driving home from way up north, and this was like a half hour from the Canadian border. We'd be driving to New York through snowstorms, listening to Crossings, Herbie Hancock's M1DC second recording, and that immediately became another Desert Islands recording. But there were other folks who were listening to all these ECM recordings, and they didn't really grab me. I don't know, the sound of the albums didn't really grab me. And you want to get me to get back to Keith Jarrett, which I will also. So for me,
you
all
remember
of
more
these,
than I do, and I just spoke to you about that.
well, you got me on a good day. No, because you're talking about my life at a certain moment. The Keith Jarrett band, the first Keith Jarrett band that I saw perform and had already fallen in love with totally, was his quote unquote American quintet with Dewey Redman and Charlie Hayden and Paul Motion. And I'm missing anybody?
No, it was a quartet.
No, that's it. It was a quartet. The first one I heard was Death in the Flower, and I performed a lot of this repertoire at the Vanguard. they were playing Survivor Suite, which is not everybody's favorite. I left that club just dazed. I just didn't know what had happened to me. And that was only one or two times that that's ever happened to me, like watching, being at a concert. Although Mahavish, well, it's more than that. Mahavishnu's live concert at Schaefer Music Festival and Woman's Skating Rink in 1973, I guess, which was released as Nothing in Eternity, Nothingness in Eternity, I think.
73, yeah.
That concert also had me I was just sort of walking out of the park. I got really lost with other people. I lost my bearings. So I went to a lot of concerts, and the Jarrett band, I don't know, that band is my favorite band of all time, with Mwadishi really coming in second. And what I loved about Jarrett, and I still do, of his recordings, because he's playing a little bit only very privately, performing anymore. Wow, there's so many different kinds of things to say. First off, I've got to say about the band, in a way, it also belongs in that same collection of bands, like all the ones I've mentioned of Circle, Revolutionary Ensemble, Miles' Lost Quintet, and Mwadishi, and all that, because the musicians are so different from each other and pay such intimate attention to one another. And almost all those albums, it's really like four people in a room simultaneously telling their own stories, but also forming this very cohesive unit. And for me, that's like, going to the Grand Canyon and looking out. Like, how do people do that? I mean, that's what I strive for with my own bands. Which, quick pitch of a new recording, which is called Transcendence Plays, music of Pat Metheny, myself and Christopher Dean Sullivan on electric bass, and Carl Latham on drums. And
we'll play some of that in our.
We'll play it on the Bob Gluck playlist.
Push.
It's on. Is it on the streaming services as well as hard copy?
It won't be on streaming until July 1st. You can get it at Bandcamp. You can find CDs now. It's really in pre-release at the moment.
All right.
But it's accessible there.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's Jared for me. Weather Report. I came to really appreciate the melodic flavor of so many of Weather Report's tunes, even through Jocko's era. And Jocko had some really gorgeous tunes that he wrote as well. I didn't like the grandstanding. I didn't like the hyper virtuosity. I didn't like the attitude. I loved the melody about it. That sort of was one of the things that had me fall in love with melody, where otherwise I was listening to Cecil Taylor and Caroline Stockhausen and Mwadishi and King Crimson and so on, which are not known to be the most melodically focused band. Anthony Braxton,
Yeah.
Pat, on the other hand, is. Gary Burton was. Miles himself was.
An interesting thing, you talk about Zawinul, which I think is one of the greatest recordings in jazz, frankly. You could tell that they did not have enough material for the second Weather Report album, Mysterious Traveler. No, not Mysterious Traveler. What am I?
I Sing the Body Electric.
I Sing the Body Electric. The difference in how, for me, disappointing that live version of Dr. Honoris Causa compared to the Zawinul version. And I even think the Cannonball Adderley version is superior to the Weather Report version. It would just seem that we don't have enough material. We got to put some live stuff in, which was commonplace back then.
Yeah. Well, if you go back, I mean, you can easily find dozens of live recordings of Weather Report from 71, 72 in particular, and later. And so I've listened to, as I said, dozens of different versions of the repertoire they were playing through that period. I know how it is that one clips from that one performance in Japan ended up being what filled out that album. I don't really quite understand, because they then had this live release, but it was released only in Japan with just those couple of tracks that make it onto the American and European releases. Is it the best? I don't know. But here's the thing: as somebody who's written, actually, I have a fourth book that's about Paul Winter, the saxophonist environmentalist that just came out in paperback. And I don't know, let me just refocus
Well,
slightly.
if I can guide you here, you're thinking about the Icarus era of Paul Winter, correct? And how it fit in seamlessly with the other stuff?
Not necessarily, no, because it's really a different topic.
Okay.
So I first heard Ralph Towner on that Weather Report album. I had no idea who he was on playing on the Moors,
Right.
which then led me to be curious about Oregon as they were coming into being. Paul Winter got my attention for two reasons. One was that he figured out something about environmentalism, and that was, and I think the way that he framed it was, he realized that he wasn't going to get anywhere helping people care about endangered species by yelling at them and telling them what they should be doing better. Instead, he wanted them to fall in love with them. So we started creating music that was beginning during the Icarus era. And I heard Icarus at my rabbi's house. Again, that was also there. And it was always like, it came out one day and there it was the next day, so seemingly. It kind of blew my mind. So Winter is beginning to do some of that kind of stuff, which wasn't so much of interest to other members of that era of Paul Winter's consort. And then he moved on, and by 1976 and onward, he'd sort of found his thing, which is to like be integrating the kind of sounds of humpback whales and other of a wolf who sound he liked, and the whales were historic recordings going back to the 50s actually. Anyway, so it was really a way of like crafting melodies that were taking off from the little motifs and riffs of these other species, and then either himself or David Darling or Jim Scott then harmonizing them and then building large sort of like spectacle-like events like the one that was at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine for 40 years. So that's a lot of what grabbed me about Paul Winter. It's a little different from the others. Was there more you wanted to talk about regarding Keith Jarrett or the chopsiness of... Oh, there is something else I want to say about the Chopsy, Chick Corea's, McLaughlin's, and Larry Coryell's. And then I'll toss in Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, only in that my friends were all listening to all that stuff. So in the car, we'd be listening to Crossings. When some of my friends were out playing with their bands, it was all Headhunters. That was a happening thing because these worlds were really colliding, and for me they weren't and some of my friends, they weren't colliding at all. They were cohabiting. When people want to talk about jazz, rock, and funk, jazz, rock, none of it makes a lot of sense to me, which is how I really got interested in writing about Pat Metheny, because it makes no sense to him. He doesn't care.
It is
There's distinctions that are meaningless.
David, by the way, Bob did write a book about Pat Metheny, in case you were wondering.
That is where we started.
I wanted to get to that, of course, but I just thought that...
No.
This is a pretty good... we could go on for a few hours.
Bob, we're all about going off on tangents. I'm sure we'll end off our interview with talking about Martha Hoople or something. But anyway...
No, I did see them, but we're not going to go there.
That was episode 1 with Mr. Robert Gluck. David, tell us about the avant-garde playlist you have curated.
Such a cool set list. We've got Herbie Hancock doing something from his Mwandishi album, a Sam Rivers track from his Loft Studio Rivby. Steve Reich and Philip Glass are 2 selections for the contemporary classical. Circle, which was a great band, Barry Auschul, Chick Corea, Anthony Braxton, and Dave Holland. We had the Revolutionary Ensemble with the incredible, incomparable, unknown to most, but what a phenomenal bass player, Fred Hopkins. The Art Ensemble of Chicago, Mulhall, Richard Abrams, Anthony Braxton, Keith Jarrett, Weather Report. How about that? We have some Miroslav Vitus, some Joe Zawinul. We even have a track by Emerson, Lake and Palm Tree. John McLaughlin, Gary Burton, and King Crimson. No, we do not have Lark's Tongue in Aspect Part 1. We have Lark's Tongue in Aspect Part 2.
Wow. Very impressive, sir. All right, stay tuned for part 2 of Bob Gluck, but here's part 1. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All right, back to the matter of money. Lolly.
Paul Lynn, please.
Say, Paul, when is it a good idea to put your pantyhose in the microwave oven for about 2 minutes?
When your house is surrounded by the police.
You gotta fucking be kidding me! How dare you call yourselves professional?
Due to unforeseen circumstances, this show will remain on the air until further notice.